who runs an organization that's been around for half a century. He will go into the detail. I'll just say that periodically we hear about his work and the organization's work. I say this particularly for the students who are matriculating in this course with whom we meet before this larger session. There are certain things in terms of social justice that would not happen if it were not for the work of a handful of advocates whose passion for this work involves all of the boring stuff of being a lawyer and all of the exciting stuff of being a lawyer who's making a difference in terms of the quality of life that we live with every day. And Yvonne is in the middle of that. So I'm going to sit down until we get into our Q&A. And I introduce the head of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, Yvonne Espinosa Madrigal.
Thank you, Professor. Is this working? Is this, no? Yes?
Is it
I have it on. It should be working, right? Okay, so I guess I just have to really speak into it. So good evening. Thank you for joining us. I want to thank Professor Landsmark for having me here with you guys today. As Professor Landsmark was saying, my name is Yvonne Espinosa Madrigal, and I run Lawyers for Civil Rights. We recently rebranded. Before that, we were Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice, and the name was a little bit too long for a contemporary attention spans. So we shortened it. We've been around since 1968. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary in the fall. And historically, the work that we do is very much part and parcel for how Boston looks and feels today. We desegregated the Boston Public Schools, which we are on the 45th anniversary this year. This June will be the 45th anniversary of Judge Garrity's school integration order in the lawsuit that we filed back at the height of the civil rights movement. And this September will be the 45th anniversary of the first integrated classrooms in Boston. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the legacy of busing and how controversial that was. So that's an important piece of work that we did back in the day that I feel continues to be not fully resolved, but that's important to note and something we can discuss today. In addition to desegregating the public schools, we integrated the Boston Police Department, the Boston Fire Department, and the Boston Public Housing projects, all through litigation that started in the 60s, 70s, and continued in some cases, particularly with the housing, continued into the 80s. So our work has historically been in desegregation and integration. Of course, these days, institutions have, by and large, been integrated, so we don't need to be suing for integrating institutions, but a lot of these same issues continue to keep us busy today. And the way that I've organized my talk is going to be along three areas: the work that we're doing locally, the work that we're doing at the state level, and the work that we're doing at the federal level against the Trump administration. And I think you'll see that all three are interconnected in many ways, but we are facing a variety of different challenges in each of these spheres. And so I think it'll be interesting for you guys to hear about some of our continued education advocacy, some of the work we're doing to fight hate crimes at the state level, and then more recently about immigrants' rights. So starting locally, one of the things that I wanted to mention was our work representing the Cook twins, which some of you might be familiar from the news. students who were disciplined for wearing their hair in braids to school at Mystic Valley Regional Charter School in Malden, Massachusetts. So these two twin students were disciplined and suspended for wearing what is essentially an ethnic and cultural expression. And this policing of black and brown bodies at the schools is something that has continued to take place in Boston and in greater Boston and frankly across the country at alarming paces. And I think also speaks to the lack of cultural competency, lack of cultural proficiency that exists in many of these institutions. In the case of Mystic Valley Charter, it was notable that there was almost a near absence of people of color at the teaching, administrative, or school board levels. We're talking about just a handful of people of color employed by the school or engaged by the school in some authoritative way, creating an environment where these type of policies that are completely, I think, inane, manage to actually happen. It's an environment where the absence of a robust people of color perspective is generating the type of policies and practices that we have to challenge and that we, in particular, had to intervene legally when it came to the Cook twins. But the absence of culturally and racially appropriate practices in schools is, of course, not unique just to charter schools. Many of us are also familiar with what happened here in Boston with the Black at BLS movement, which involved, similarly, students of color, black students, many of them women of color, coming forward talking about their experiences living with and surviving a racially hostile environment and climate at Boston Latin School. And a lot of what these students had to say also echoes what happened at Mystic Valley. We're talking about racial isolation. We're talking about an environment that doesn't have much diversity, whether it's at the student level or at the teaching level, and that frankly just doesn't reflect what the current demographics in Boston are. The city is overwhelmingly a majority-minority city, and most of our public schools reflect that, but not when it comes to Boston's elite exam schools, like BLS, Boston Latin School, where students of color are a minority of the student body, and where they continue to experience isolation, the same type of isolation that led to the Black at BLS incident, and that continues to be something that we have to work with. You know, beyond the exam schools, I think that we have all probably seen the incredibly disturbing headlines about the resegregation of public schools. Those headlines were coming out less than a year ago, and most recently with the Spotlight series' amazing work tracking each and every valedictorian from Boston Public Schools in recent years and seeing the incredibly anemic and in some cases harrowing experiences that they survived and lived through. Everything from homelessness to not being able to complete college degrees to feeling completely unsupported, whether it was academically or emotionally, while they were going through school and transitioning into college. And if this is what's happening to la creme de la creme, right, the valedictorians at our public schools, the students who are supposed to represent the most promise because they're at the top of their class, what is happening to the rest of the students when we dig deeper into the class? I mean, that is something that sends chills down my spine to think that this is the quality of education and outcomes that we're getting from Boston Public Schools. And I hope it's the type of thing that you will ask the superintendent when she's here next week, whether she's here alone or with her team of technical experts, because these are exactly the questions that we have to be asking as a city. What are we doing to make sure that the fate of not just these valedictorians, but of all of the students in Boston Public Schools is actually something to be proud of? And what are we doing to address these type of incidents like Black and BLS that pose a challenge to the learning opportunities of students of color? Now, talking about diversity, I just want to quickly make a plug about also the lack of diversity in Boston's public safety agencies. And here I'm talking about the cops and the firefighters. We have faced, not just in the school arena, but also when we talk about these public safety agencies, entrenched resistance, strong interest in maintaining a status quo. Without litigation, there has been no progress in helping to diversify or shore up ways to improve the experience of people of color who work there or who want to be able to work there. It shouldn't take a lawsuit to bring greater diversity to places like BPS, BPD, or BFD. It really shouldn't. Because the way I see it, and I'm a Boston resident, that is using our tax dollars to maintain and defend discriminatory systems and practices. In just one of our discrimination cases against BPD that the city is fighting tooth and nail like scorched earth litigation, the city has spent more than $1 million defending its racist and discriminatory practices. That is your tax dollars at work. Moving to the state level, one of the things that I want to point to, and I'm sure you guys have also seen this in the news, is the work that we have to do right now and that we're actively doing to oppose the wave of hate crimes that has been sweeping through our country, and we are not immune. We are talking about 3 years in a row, an increase in the level of hate crimes. Even as the overall rate of crimes, just crimes overall, right? Assaults, battery, whatever. Overall rate of crime is down, way down. Hate crimes are up. So even in this trend of less criminal activity, people are actually making an exception to go out and do harm to many people of color, people who look like many of us in this room. It is in its highest in over a decade. And we're not just talking about hate crimes, we're talking about all types of different manifestations of hate. Just last summer, there were headlines about an 8-year-old boy, biracial kid, who was nearly lynched by a group of teenagers not too far from here. Elected officials have been reluctant to address these systemic problems. And we have complete and utter silence from the State House on what we can be doing to shore up the way we investigate, the way we document, and the way we hold perpetrators of hate crimes accountable. Everything from soups to nuts must be shored up, and here in progressive Massachusetts, we are frankly no better than what's happening in places like Tennessee or Texas. Turning to the federal level, which is probably what's the sexiest thing these days, and also related to a lot of the racial tendencies that I was just discussing, particularly the hate crimes, you know, as a civil rights organization, as a litigation shop, because that's our sweet spot. What we do is bring cases to bring forth social change and to bring access to justice, right? Just the same way that we sued the public schools to integrate them back in the 1960s and 1970s, we continue to do that litigation today. And we have been extraordinarily active because just because you have Trump in office doesn't mean that the work that we were doing litigating against discriminatory practices in BPD goes away. Absolutely not. Instead, it is now working in multiple fronts. And because the federal government has essentially abandoned civil rights enforcement, I mean, literally gutting entire sections of the Department of Justice, we have been pulled into action to fill that gap. And so at my organization, 8 lawyers right here in Boston, lawyers for civil rights. That's the type of work we're doing. And what is incredible is, and I'm mirroring a lot of what I'm talking about, the lack of initiative, the lack of an appropriate response to the climate that's happening around us. One of the most, I think, insightful incidents that highlights this is exactly what happened in Charlottesville, among other incidents of racial violence. And I'm going to repeat what happened in Charlottesville, what was being chanted, just to remind us of exactly what we are facing. The Jews will not replace us. The blacks will not replace us. Immigrants will not replace us. Talk about a powerful reminder that anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia are all alive and well, and also intergenerational in nature. Hate and bigotry were happening in Charlottesville, and it's happening across the country, not by, older racist people, which I think is what a lot of people tend to think is, oh, well, these problems are going to go away as older, less tolerant generations go away. Well, as we saw from Charlottesville, that's not who was out there chanting these terrible things. It was college students, the age of many of the people who are sitting in this room right now. These are future leaders, or at the very least, future professionals. Hate and bigotry, my friends, will not die with each passing generation. Rather, as even the most recent incident at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial remind us, where there was a confrontation with a Native American tribal elder, bigotry can and bigotry has been passed down with each generation as an heirloom. And we are not immune. And that is precisely why my organization continues to be just as active today as we were 50 years ago. I think an insightful piece, and I hope you guys caught it, and if not, I urge you to read it, is an excellent analysis by Renee Graham in The Globe, where she talks about how these white kids are infantilized when that same quality is never given to kids like Trayvon Martin or Tamir Rice. One thing that she says in the piece, and that I want to echo because for me it really hit home. So I will quote Renee when she says, "I do not equate MAGA, Make America Great Again, gear with traditional, I do equate MAGA gear with traditional Klan attire. The sartorial choices change, but the racism remains the same." And I think that's so important because what we've seen, not just in Charlottesville and in other incidents across the country, is that people are completely coming out of the closet as white supremacists without a hood. You see this openly in white supremacist rallies. And we held one right here in the Boston Common not too long ago. Against this backdrop of what I will call, for lack of a better word, just intense racial tension and hostility, we are also seeing a parallel dismantlement of immigration programs. There used to be a dichotomy, which was false, but but bear with me because it did exist and it was relevant for legal policy and community discourse, between good immigrants and bad immigrants. Good immigrants were children, like the DACA kids, children who were brought here through no fault of their own, and who were victims, essentially. And bad people, of course, if that's the good immigrant, the bad immigrant, presumably, are their parents. So think about the damage that this type of construct does to kids and families, but still bear with me with this false construct, because even as terrible as it was, at least we were able to get DACA relief under Obama using that trope, using that model. But these fine lines, even the notion of a good immigrant, is gone. All immigrants are now bad immigrants. And we are also dangerous. And this growing narrative is essentially summed up this way. Someone who looks different from you is coming to take your livelihood. And that is what they're selling. They are selling a zero-sum game. As an immigrant myself, this is a vision of America that I simply cannot recognize. I was raised by a single immigrant mom who worked very hard cleaning homes and cleaning toilets to put food on the table. Even then, we couldn't make ends meet. We went without health insurance for almost our entire lives until I got a job, until Obama opened up an exchange in my mom's state. But one thing that my mom did teach me is to believe in the American dream. And as the first person in my family to go to college, as the first person in my family to go to law school, I was taught that if you work hard, you create your own opportunity, that there is no ceiling, that there's also no scarcity. That is what we fled when we came from Central America, scarcity, among other things. Here, a rising tide is supposed to lift all boats. That's what my mom taught me, that you add seats to the table, and you certainly don't take seats away. But that is not what is being taught now. What's being taught now is that everything we have as Americans, our democracy, our economy, our opportunities, are finite. And that is an extremely dangerous message. This new zero-sum vision of America, coupled with racism, is precisely why sanctuary cities were threatened with defunding. DACA has been terminated. Immigrants, refugees in temporary protected status, TPS, are now in limbo because that program has also been closed. Asylum is being restricted and limited. Muslims were banned. Armed troops are greeting caravans full of unarmed women and little children fleeing violence at our border. And our federal government continues to separate children from their mothers. Rounding up immigrants, including victims of domestic violence, in our local and state courts, even when they show up to court just to get a restraining order. I am very proud that 8 lawyers, with 8 lawyers in my office, we filed the first cases in the country to stop the defunding of sanctuary cities, to protect immigrants and TPS, to stop immigration from doing courthouse arrests immediately after we uncovered information that arrests had taken place in 24 courthouses across the state. And we filed the first damages class action on behalf of children who were separated by Trump, asking for these children to be paid for the mental harm, the mental health work that they will need to do, the mental health services that they will need to be able to be made whole. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. The work that we're doing right now is not just life-changing, but it's also law-changing. And it's at this particular moment where so many people out there feel uncertain, feel fear, feel that there's no one out there who has their back. Those are the people that we help at Lawyers for Civil Rights. And we've been doing that since we desegregated the public schools. And I'm really proud that we continue to do that today, whether it's with the Cook twins in Malden or the immigrants, the immigrant mothers who showed up in my office after being released without their kids, not knowing where they were. That's the work that we're here to do. And I would be happy to answer questions and engage in more of a dialogue, but I think this is a good place to end in terms of giving you a snapshot of, like I said, the work that we're doing locally, statewide, and the tendencies that we are responding to at the federal level. So happy to continue chatting with you guys in any of these areas or other areas that you guys might have questions on.
to make a personal comment here. You know, many of us, when we went to law school, thought that we would grow up to be civil rights lawyers. And then various aspects of life took over, and that's not what we ended up doing. Many of the speakers who come before us are university professors or folks involved with government, and the fact is we're in pretty privileged positions. Lawyers for Civil Rights is out there, not supported by big money, federal, right?
No. No, not supported by big money. We do this work on what I would call a church mouse budget.
Right. So what I would start with is the simple fact that if there is any speaker we have brought before you who deserves your support, it's here. And he'll let you know how after, but you're doing the legal work that keeps people honest. And I think your opening remarks reflect that. I want to jump right into questions. I have questions, but
yeah,
I think what you said inspired a number of questions. So
please.
Let's start way up in the back.
I always do better in rebuttal, so I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Please.
Hi. I wanted to sort of, my big thing is housing and transportation, and I feel that the Commonwealth is doing a horrible job, and I think that Baker should stick to baking his cookies. Instead, you know, classism has been more alive and well than in the 80s. There's more classism today than ever before. It is a problem. It's never addressed. It is a kind of discrimination, and it's worse than the 80s. I've experienced discrimination, and I have also experienced threats for being in the way of progress. And the new landlords that take the Section 8, that's supposed to take Section 8 or mixed income, they're now charging water and sewer if you can get in when they're not mixed income. But yet, the expiring use tenants get nothing. After 30 plus years, 30 to 60 years, we're being thrown out, told, so what, suck it up, live, you know, where I say you should live. Live beyond this border. You can't cross this border. Why should you want to cross this border? You've only lived in the metro area your entire life, and you don't drive. Even with people with excellent credit, get no help, get lots of thank yous, but it's worth nothing. And I'm the minority here. 60-40 is not what you call equal discrimination or equal opportunity.
No,
I'm
hear
the
you.
minority here. Born in the U.S., as a resident, and I'm a third-class citizen.
I hear you loud and
And I want to
clear.
know, how come you're not helping my building? We're an expiring use building. There are thousands and thousands of people that are being thrown out with no mixed income. There's no mixed income buildings anywhere.
Yeah, I hear you loud and clear on the need for much more robust protections in the housing and transportation space.
So the new landlords, they get water and sewer. They get the no-interest loan, and then they expect people to pay water and sewer. Tenants in Massachusetts have never paid for water and sewer, but yet we should want to pay for water and sewer to have a Moen faucet and a pool table. And there aren't any mixed income buildings.
Yeah,
And we have to
so
keep it
addressing,
on. It's
to
in
address
order.
the question, because I got the gist of the question. So I completely agree that housing and transportation are key areas. I think if you ask, I know, that if you knock on any door in Greater Boston, regardless of whether it is a working class family or an affluent family, housing and rising housing costs is the #1 issue. It is the #1 concern across race, across class, across neighborhoods. Housing is a huge problem.
But they're redlining people with lesser incomes.
And we need to do more advocacy, and that advocacy needs to be done locally. We need to do more advocacy with City Hall, with the city councilors, to make sure that more housing protections are in place. I know that a number of community groups have advanced some proposals that frankly look really, really interesting if we could get them passed, if we could get political support for exactly the things that you're talking about. All of this really boils down to what are the type of political policy initiatives that we could get done at the local level. Because there's no litigation that we're going to be able to file to assert those rights. There is no right to be exempt from gentrification. There is no right to be exempt from the displacement that is sweeping through our communities based on exactly the type of developments and changes that are happening in our communities. There's no right to be exempt to that. But we can and should advocate for ourselves in exactly the way you're doing it. But I think it's important to take that, exactly what you're saying, and the rest of what you have written down, and say it to the mayor, say it to the city councilor.
I've been invited twice, and I just wanted you to know that classism and ageism, especially classism, it's not addressed anywhere. It's not, it's one of those things that's never, it's not even on the list.
I agree with you completely on that, and I think that we will have to do a lot more rethinking, not just as a civil rights community, but as a society, on where we stand on those issues of inequality and class. The Supreme Court in San Antonio, Rodriguez versus San Antonio Public Schools, declared in the 1970s that income status, that class, is not a protected class. It is not a protected category. So I can sue and say that somebody's being discriminated based on their race or gender, right, or religion. But I cannot sue and say that somebody's being discriminated because they're low income. And that is wrong. I think Rodriguez was wrongly decided. I think we need to reassess that. But even if we don't get to the Supreme Court to reassess those things, the type of concerns you're raising are precisely the type of concerns that we should be seeing addressed locally. Nothing prevents the city from introducing rent control, or I should say reintroducing it, right? Nothing prevents the city from introducing more protections, let's say just cause eviction, which is one of the campaigns that has been led. You're nodding, so you're familiar, I'm sure other people in the room are too, by a wide range of community groups that are concerned about the displacement of especially low-income people from communities that are now gentrifying. Those are the type of initiatives that should and must be explored. You know, but you're not going to get that through litigation. And I think that's a good example of some things that we can do as a litigation shop and some things that are just not up for courts to do. And so I think it's a good line in terms of the limits of what we could do using courts. Because what you're talking about really lends itself for the type of policy support that should come from the political leadership at the local level. So let's move on to another question.
Does that mean you're going to be helping expiring use buildings?
No, whoa. We've been very, and I have to move on, but we've been very, very vocal about the rights of, you know, we've come out against gentrification, we've come out in support of of just cause eviction, so we will be happy to continue to talk to you or to other groups offline about what we're doing to secure housing in the city. But certainly Lawyers for Civil Rights is an ally, not just in the housing struggle, but in the transportation struggle too, particularly with the Fairmont Line. So yeah, over here.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you for being here. So I'm a teacher. I teach at Boston Public Schools. I teach part-time now. I used to teach 4th grade full-time at the Murphy in Dorchester. The questions are on the Garrity ruling, particularly the teachers of color, the aspects in there, and how Boston Public Schools have been out of compliance.
For 45 years.
And so my question, I guess, is when the new superintendent, when Tommy Chang came, I was asking, like, because I was in the teaching at the time, one of the only male teacher of color in elementary school, asking about that, because the ruling addressed yet it wasn't met, and it was in the papers that, oh, we aren't meeting that, but I didn't really hear any accountability or
That's a great
anything
question.
around efforts to enforce it, and so.
That's a really great question. That's an excellent question, and you are right. And just by way of background, when we desegregated the schools in the 70s, like I was mentioning in 1974, Judge Garrity, the federal judge who ruled in our favor, issued an extremely lengthy and well worth reading decision. It's in the case Morgan versus Hennigan. That was the school deseg case. And the Garrity Order, the final decision in the case, had a number of different components. The city has met most of the components, and so it has satisfied some of the obligations under the deseg order. The one, probably the biggest thing that the city has failed to meet are requirements surrounding teacher diversity. Under the order, in a nutshell, 25% of the teachers have to be black, 5% of the teachers have to be other teachers of color. So in other words, 30% of the teachers had to be of color. The city has never met that, and I also feel that the city has looked at the decision more kind of like as a ceiling rather than a floor, which is crazy, especially when we're talking about a legal order from 1974 that frankly is outdated, and that the city should be doing much, much better than what was expected of it back in 1974. I can't speak too much about this because we are actually in discussions with the city right now surrounding enforcement of the Garrity Order, so I think that should give you a sense of where I'm going. But we are in active conversations with the city right now about how the city can come into compliance with the requirements of Garrity as soon as possible. This is something that we have taken extremely seriously. It is a high priority for my office to fully enforce the Garrity Order, and we would not be shy to use the court again to impose new requirements on the district. It is shameful that we have not been able to meet what I think are low-hanging fruit requirements that come down from the height of the civil rights era that we should really be talking about improving upon. What can we be doing to meet the 21st century needs of our city instead of talking about coming into compliance with an order that is 45 years old? Not that Mayor Walsh created these problems. These problems, of course, have been inherited. But what I will say is that we need to put a lot more political pressure on the mayor's office to take this seriously and for him to own the problem and to come out in front of it. So a really great question. Thank you for that, about the Garrity Order. There was a question back there, you, and then you.
Hi, so my question surrounds the idea of deciding about how much surrounds the idea that some people are hurt by decisions. So for example, I think everyone would agree that desegregating schools was a good thing. However, the busing and the busing riots that occurred harmed many, many people. And so when there are decisions made, especially about civil rights, not only are you putting you're putting people's lives in danger. And so perhaps today it's a lesser extent, but when illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants are taken to court, they're exposed. And so how do you weigh the danger that you put the people that you're trying to help in over the grander scheme of things?
That's a really nice strategic question about how we formulate our work. And I have to say that I tip my hat every day to the courageous plaintiffs, the courageous clients who step up and do this. It is not easy. It wasn't easy for the kids and the families that signed up with us to desegregate the Boston Public Schools. It's not easy for the Cook twins. It's not easy for the students black at BLS. It's not easy for any of these clients in our most recent wave of immigrants' rights cases against the Trump administration. It's not easy. And there's tremendous amount of fear. you often have to do a lot of hand-holding. There's also anger, I think we've seen, how emotional some of these issues can be. And I think that's good, right? People should be angry about the indignities that they have been made to suffer, the brutality that is visited upon them by not just our society, but by institutions that should be there to protect them. And so I think there's no silver bullet to your question. There's no silver bullet for how to do this. I think it is hard work, and you have to do a lot of hand-holding as you're doing these cases. Oftentimes, we want to do certain cases because people come to our office and report the problems, but then they shy away and they say, I can't do that, And so it takes a lot of courage and I think wraparound support to be able to do it. I'll just share one story in particular that I think illustrates this well. Boston Police Department has shot an unarmed young black man, Terrence Coleman, in the South End about 2 years ago. We sued on behalf of his mother, Hope Coleman, who was at the scene of the killing and says that her son was unarmed and had posed no threat, and that the responding officers to a 911 call where she was asking for an ambulance to take him to the hospital because he has schizophrenia. And so she called 911 asking for an ambulance. The police arrived instead of an ambulance and shot her son on sight. In the wave of a lot of the shootings of unarmed black men that have happened through the country, right? We're just one shooting away from Ferguson, and the Terrence Coleman shooting shows just how vulnerable our communities are for this, and the fact that we have no policy in place in Boston for our first responders and police officers to deal and handle people who are experiencing mental health emergencies. Zero policy. It failed in Coleman. We still don't have a remedy. But what I was going to say is, you can imagine Hope Coleman after what happened to her son. And Hope Coleman came to us, and she didn't come because she wanted to sue the hell out of BPD, which is what she needs to do and what we ultimately did. She came to us because the fact that he wasn't bringing in income into the apartment means that she was about to lose her apartment. It also was the fact that he died intestate. He had no will, and she needed to deal with the probate proceedings in connection with her son's death. We needed to stabilize Miss Coleman, make sure that she had a roof over her head, make sure that she could address the estate of her deceased son, before we could even talk about suing BPD to hold them accountable for what they did to her son. So you can imagine the amount of work that needs to go into developing these cases, where sometimes we're doing ancillary work, wraparound, holistic, comprehensive support, to be able to stabilize the client enough to have a conversation about, now let's talk about, right, what really interests us. Not to say that the other things that interest us, but we're in the business of suing for class actions, impact litigation, to make policy changes, not to wrap up a will. But we needed to do that. And so we have to be able to roll up our sleeves and do that to help our clients. And so we take our clients the way they come in the door. And oftentimes that means connecting them with social workers. Oftentimes that means connecting them with other benefits or services, just so that they can have a conversation with us about the big problem that is also looming overhead. It's difficult work, and it's challenging. And I think the Hope Coleman incident really illustrates the complexities surrounding the development of these cases and how you provide support for clients and plaintiffs.
And as a reminder, we will have the police commissioner here in another few weeks, so it's an opportunity to follow up on that. But you raise another question. Unfortunately, there's plenty of work for you folks to have to do.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you prioritize which kinds of cases you're prepared to take on, and how much of a resource within an 8-person office you can devote to a particular set of issues at any point in time?
Well, the answer to that is a lot. But we have over 40 active cases right now. So Hope Coleman, TPS, Sanctuary Cities are just the tip of the iceberg. We have 40 active cases. We receive over 20 requests for legal assistance a day. And we have to sort through that and identify where do we get the most bang for our buck? Where do we get the most impact? And so we take cases that involve an individual, we take class actions. We're very flexible. We do not shy away from even taking one individual's case if it means it's in a key industry, or it's against a key defendant, or it's like industry. My friend in the audience mentioned Section 8. We've taken individual Section 8 cases where we're saying, you, landlord, cannot discriminate on the basis of the fact that this person has a Section 8 voucher. Nobody has ever heard of this client. Nobody's ever heard of this landlord. But we do those individual cases because we feel it's really important to make sure that Section 8 vouchers are respected. And so we do everything from those individual cases to the big cases that we have against Trump. And so we do have to say no a lot more than we say yes. But in our office, the culture is a yes culture. So we go out of our way to make sure that we can take as much as we can take, and to do so responsibly. So we do not decline unless we can say, you know, this is not the right home for that work, or we simply don't have the bandwidth for that work. But even in those cases, what we would tell to people is, we can't take your case right now, but your case has merit. Can you please circle back with us maybe in a month or so when we can revisit? So our culture is yes. Many other organizations, the culture is no. The culture is, you know, we will cherry pick the cases and only take the sexiest. Sure, we cherry pick and we take sexy cases, but in our culture, in our office, the culture is to make sure that everybody who contacts us is better off, and to take as many of the cases that come to us that have merit as possible. Because that's the only way we can do the work. I mean, we are one of the few places in all of New England that provides free legal support for people who are experiencing legal issues based on race or on immigration. That's our work.
What happens when you lose?
We rarely lose. Rarely lose, so I don't know what you're talking about, Professor Lindbergh.
Okay, next question.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Up there, and then we'll get back to you.
But I will say this about a loss. You have to think about redefining what losing means. There are, of course, you know, we do have a very high success rate, like over 90-some%. But even in the instances where we have lost, it creates opportunity for dialogue. If we get shut out of court, if, for example, the court says, there is no legal remedy that I can provide, we start working up other angles, pressing on City Hall, pressing on the State House to do through policy and legislative advocacy what we couldn't do in the court. So even a loss at the court can tee us up to then go to City Council and say, hey, the court is saying this is in your lane. You need to fix this, and you need to work with us to fix it. And so you have to think about it as a long game. Mm-hmm. It's a marathon, and the way I see it is multiple methodologies have to be deployed simultaneously for us to achieve progress and social change. Litigation is one. We also need policy advocacy, community outreach and education. All of that needs to be deployed simultaneously. And so if we lose in court, which is rare, but if we do, that's why you have those other multiple complementing methodologies also moving forward. It's all trains running on parallel tracks towards the same station. And so you can't put all of your eggs in one basket.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned how Black children are criminalized and how destructive that is, and that happens in schools, in charter schools, yes, absolutely, at DPS. So does it make sense for your organization to be involved in trying to disrupt that injustice that, folks talk about the school-to-prison pipeline?
Absolutely. And you mentioned it, the school-to-prison pipeline. I would say it's actually the school-to-prison to deportation pipeline. We've had 2 confirmed instances of kids who were written up for simple things. Attempting to start a fight. In other words, did not even get into a fight. They were written up. Those incident reports were then somehow, magically, if you ask the city of Boston or Boston Public Schools, end up in the hands of immigration officials and get used in immigration court to effectuate the deportation. And it's happened not once, twice, that we know of in our office, of 2 students from East Boston High School who have been deported based on these write-ups, non-violent, non-drug related, non-weapons related incidents, right? Because one can understand that if it's a violent or weapon or drugs, maybe somehow these things got escalated, but it was attempting to start a fight. And so the school-to-prison pipeline is real, and the school-to-prison to deportation pipeline is real. And this isn't something that is abstract and that happened somewhere far removed. It happened just a few miles down the street in East Boston High School. So these things are extremely worrying. We sued Boston Public Schools for the incident of deportation that happened, to also uncover more information about how these records just miraculously appeared in immigration court to the detriment of kids who purportedly live in a sanctuary city. The mayor saying that he will convert City Hall into a shelter, but yet Boston Public Schools and City Hall couldn't stop the deportation of 2 innocent kids who were picked up by immigration. That's the world we're living in. And it's really terrible that these incidents are happening in schools. And and you were talking about Black kids in particular, and I fully agree with that. I feel that the brunt of this is typically borne by Black students. I feel the brown students are now feeling it because of the climate at the federal level and the immigration implications in a way that really hadn't happened as acutely as what we're seeing. But yes, students are being disciplined based on their identity all the time. Just this week in my office, a student called, one of the few Black students in a suburban public school, an affluent suburban public school, shall remain nameless because we're still dealing with them, and we haven't sued yet. Maybe we won't have to. But the mother called us because the kid is regularly referred to as dangerous, because he happens to be, bigger and taller than most of the kids in his grade. And, this is happening in well-resourced school districts that should know better. So we're seeing this tendency of what I was talking about before, of white kids get to be infantilized, but certainly not this Black student who has already been marked as dangerous by his school, even though he's never done anything. But he's considered dangerous. And so we see this routinely. The other way that we're seeing this is also through other forms of identity-based bullying, particularly in the suburban school districts. Many kids who, it might be the only cheerleader who is Black, or the only football player who is, in some cases, Jewish in a school district, right? Any type of identity-based bullying. and cultures that replicate these and that tolerate these identity-based incidents of bullying in schools. And so we've seen tons of this in our office. To the extent that it involves anti-Semitism, we refer those to the Anti-Defamation League. If it's an incident of race or immigration status, we handle that in-house. But these things have erupted across Greater Boston, and we need to do a lot more work to make sure that here in progressive Massachusetts, we really ascribe to best practices about how to deal with this. So this is one of our biggest practice areas, is making sure that kids of color are not being bullied or otherwise unfairly treated at schools. And we've produced, if you go to our website, lawyersforcivilrights.org, we've produced reports, toolkits, and other fact sheets all around student discipline and the treatment of students in school. So it might be worth looking at if you're curious. And we have some, like I said, toolkits for students so that they can also know their rights and assert them as they interface school officials.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your appearance here. I'm not familiar with this Cook twins story, but you did allude to the fact that there may be some cultural insensitivity in terms of that community. What fact does the defendant claim in respect to what they did?
You know, we didn't have to sue the school. There was such a big brouhaha about it, particularly because I'm surprised you didn't hear about it. It hit a lot of newspapers and TV news networks. There was such a backlash against the school that the school really felt that it needed to come out in front of it.
So the community responded the way you'd expect them to?
Well, at the end, yes. Luckily, yes, they did. It was, you know, it wasn't an easy road to get there, but they did ultimately. We did not have to sue, which was nice. You know, it was. I think there are. First of all, I feel regardless of what institution we're talking about, whether it's that particular school or any workplace or any institution for that matter, I think cultural sensitivity training is critical. I think it is really, really critical. You know, it's one of the things that we've been trying to push in terms of making sure that all teachers have that at public schools, charter schools, regardless of the city. All police officers, all fire department officers, all public safety officers have appropriate professional cultural sensitivity training because the absence of that makes a big difference. And there were things that we were raising in that particular case and in others, like the dangerous kid in middle school in the suburbs right now, that the schools are just like, really? That's racist? I never thought about it that way. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, well, if you had actually, you know, just taken a step back and even done just a basic cultural competency training, I think some of these things would have been red flags. In this particular school, I'll just use this by way of example, the policy said no hair alterations. And the only hair alterations that were disciplined were braids. Kids wore blue hair to school. Kids wore, you know, eclectic and eccentric hairstyles to school, which were a violation of the policy. So the policy was never enforced when white kids would wear, you know, certain hairstyles. It was just enforced on black kids. It was enforced on black girls. And that disparity is what creates the discrimination. The disparate use of a tool that should be used, or at least on the books, right? It's supposed to be race neutral, but it's never applied in a race neutral way. That creates the disparity. That creates the discrimination. And often, you know, and seriously, it's not about picking, you know, and singling out the school. I'm just using it by way of example. And ultimately, the school came out in front of it and adjusted its policies and made other reforms and changes. But that particular example is something that I feel is really apropos because it applies to many institutions, right? Cops have the capacity to stop and frisk anyone, but if they're only stopping and frisking black youth, that's discrimination, right? You have the capacity to stop any car to ask about what's happening, right? And if you meet certain suspicious criteria. But if you're only stopping black drivers, that's racial profiling, right? So it's using tools and policies that, in theory, are supposed to be applied in race-neutral ways, but that, in effect, actually get used disproportionately and, in some instances, exclusively against black people or black and brown people, depending on what the player we're talking about is. And so, so I think it's important to go beyond intent, right? Because I'm not going to debate whether people have good or bad intent. You know, for me, it's irrelevant. For me, what matters is the discriminatory result. And if we have a discriminatory result, and oftentimes that is bore out by data, right? If you say, show me the race of all of the people you stopped and frisked, and 90% of them are black, right? Like, that is data confirmed disparity. That's what we need to tackle, and that's what we need to talk about. So I'm not saying that the intention of these school officials was bad. As a matter of fact, the fact that they came out in front of it shows that Mystic Valley Charter School was able to address this, like you're saying, in a proactive and favorable manner. But I don't think it's people's intentions on trial. I think it is a disparity in outcome that's in trial. And we need to talk about that. We need to talk about how do we get in front of that. And I think that's the difficult thing, because that's where people get offensive, right, or defensive, right? It's like, I'm not a racist. Well, I'm not calling you a racist, but what I am saying is that there's certain policies or practices in your police department or in your school, or fill in the blank, right, that are yielding results that are less than desirable. And I would hope that all of us, regardless of our race, who are in the other side of that conversation, would be like, oh shit, that concerns me too, right? And be able to meet halfway about, do we need to do some cultural competency training, or should we institute a monitoring system so that we can keep track of, who we're stopping, who we're putting in detention. I mean, that's the type of conversation I would like to have.
So could you elaborate further on what some of those proactive steps would be, and whether you've seen both quantitative and qualitative positive outcomes coming from that? I mean, my frustration with lawyering when I did it was that I always had to wait until a harm had taken place, and then I'd have the case in my office, and then I could address it. But I felt frustrated that there wasn't a lot that I could do proactively to try to prevent some of those negative behaviors. And you've described cultural sensitivity training. What are the kinds of things like that you've seen put in place, and how effective are they?
I'll share one, I think, particularly applaud-worthy example. We approached Airbnb. We were the first organization in the country to approach Airbnb and say, look, you're having a discrimination problem in your platform. There are too many people coming to us saying that they got rejected by homeowners. You guys are familiar with Airbnb, right? It's that platform where you go and you try to score a really nice place in a tourist site that you're visiting for a good price, hopefully cheaper than a hotel room, but that entails a transaction with a private individual, but that conversation is mediated through that platform, through that website. So if I'm putting up my apartment in Boston through Airbnb, right, I should, theoretically, be open to anybody staying in my apartment. So I should not be in the business of screening people who want to pay to stay in my apartment to say, oh, Ted, you're black, I'm sorry, but I don't let black people sleep here, And that's literally some of the responses that people were getting.
I got one of those.
You should have come to me, you should have come to me.
Yes, go on.
Sometimes you find clients like this, you see? Come to me, let's talk. Let me give you my business card. But that is, people, this happens.
But is it the ownership on the individual who's harmed to report it, or the company to like figure out?
Our take on this is that since Airbnb manages the platform, coordinates the transactions, handles the exchange of money, the obligations to comply with fair housing laws have to fall on Airbnb. And so we blew it up. We said, you know, this is crazy. People are getting these racist messages. I mean, bluntly racist messages. And, you know, and they can't transact in your website. This is discrimination. And just because you're a digital e-commerce, you know, player doesn't exempt you from historic civil rights protections and anti-discrimination protections that all brick and mortars comply with. And to their credit, they immediately called me and they were like, holy shit, thank you for flagging this. We would like to have a meeting with you to talk about how our platform works and the suggestions and recommendations that you put in the letter, but additional ones that you may have once you get a better understanding of how the platform works. And so we went through a series of meetings with Airbnb's general counsel and top-level people, and they were incredibly amenable. You know, we threw everything in the kitchen sink at them, right? Like change everything. And, you know, and we knew they weren't going to change everything, right? But that's just what lawyers do here. But they responded incredibly favorably. If we gave them, let's say, 10 things, they adopted 10. They adopted 5, you know, without question. It was like, yes, 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 no. And then we went back to them and we were like, okay, let's talk about the 5 that you didn't take and try to compromise some more. But the fact that they immediately came out and they said, yes, there is a discrimination problem in our platform. No, we do not want to have that. And we want to come out in front of this. We're going to strengthen this with the recommendations of civil rights lawyers, and these are the things that we're going to do. And the current platform that exists, if you guys have been in it over the last year, is actually the modified one that we helped to put into place. And they even came up with things like you have to, when you register to put your house up for rent there, you have to sign a non-discrimination agreement. And the discrimination agreement says that if you get caught discriminating, you got booted out of the Airbnb community. So I mean, we not only made concrete modifications to the platform in partnership with Airbnb, but we created monitoring and accountability measures for moving forward. That was probably one of the most successful, affirmative things that I've ever seen in my career, in 15 plus years of practicing civil rights. But my point is, it's not unusual to get a player who wants to play well and who is concerned about this. And so there are good models out there for both private and public entities that want to come out in front of this. They don't want to be racist. They don't want to be associated with that. They don't want to foster discrimination. And so there are good models. Not everything is as adversarial as what we have sometimes experienced. I'm actually surprised by how adversarial sometimes things can get, and I think that's just a function of these days everything becomes a federal case very quickly. But I wish that we were able to resolve things like the way we did with Mystic Valley, the way we did with Airbnb. That is a lot less resource intensive for us, and it gets the outcome we want much quicker than having to go through, you know, protracted litigation to do it. And I think it gives all of us an opportunity to have a win-win, to claim victory instead of being dragged through a court case. So I would love to see more things being resolved that way.
Yeah, you've kind of reassured me that it's okay to go back to that platform, because when it happened to me, first of all, I was deeply insulted and hurt. And secondly, I thought to myself, why should I give my credit card number to someone who's going to treat me this way? I mean, you know, it's my money, and all I want is a bed for the night.
That's right.
This is insane. And so I've never been back. You know, that this is in fact the way all of us, it seems to me, many of us respond. Why should we continue to be insulted by some racist?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I could have kept challenging, but I have choices.
Yeah.
And one choice is not to be treated poorly by a racist.
That's right.
But then that closes me off to certain types of opportunities too. I mean, it's as you say with the travails that clients go through, people don't always think about what the longer term effects are on those people who are being victimized by these folks.
Right.
I mean, it just sort of reads as an insult, but in fact, there's always a long-term effect.
Yeah.
You know, anyway.
I agree completely. That reminds me of one thing. You know, we are in the business of changing laws, but we're also in the business of changing minds and hearts. We can't do this work just in the court of law. We have to do the work in the court of public opinion. And that's why it's so important to try to find as many opportunities to work in partnership as possible.
Oh, and just one other thing that I've been mulling around that. How do you publicize the work that you do? If you get a victory, and it's not, you know, a big piece of litigation that's going to get covered, how do you get the word out that in fact you've started down a path towards a real change with someone?
Yeah, so we have our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter. We have the website lawyersforcivilrights.org, and we just redid the website when we rebranded, so instead of calling it Our Work, it's called Our Impact. That's why our marketing people said we should use, you know, all these fancy things, way beyond my capacity. I'm riffraff. But so if you go to our website and click on Our Impact, you'll see literally a list of all of the work that we're doing. That's where we put, you know, we're doing X, or we accomplished Y, we sued so-and-so, or we settled so-and-so. So that's always a good news source. We also have had, over the last few years, incredible visibility in the news. So we are regularly covered in the Globe. We are regularly covered by local and national NPR, especially with some of these major filings against the Trump administration. The Globe ran a phenomenal Sunday full-page spread, multiple-page spread and cover about one of the lead plaintiffs in our TPS litigation against Trump. Her name is Patricia Carvajal. If you haven't seen the piece about TPS in the Globe, you should read it. It's phenomenal, and it's really humanizes this issue. So we do try as much as possible to get into the mainstream press, but the Globe picks what it wants. So sometimes some things will not be in the Globe, but you can certainly find it on our website. So I see a hand over here, a hand over here. Oh, two. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
So litigation often paints problem, or has a tendency to paint problems as, I guess, being a story involving a bad actor of some kind. So I was wondering, how do you ensure that your cases are seen as systemic problems and kind of broaden your implicated classes of actors, both for purposes of precedence and for public perception? And to what extent have you been successful and unsuccessful? And yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, you are right. I mean, litigation is adversarial in nature. I mean, we're suing a bad actor.
Yeah, to make a compelling story, yeah.
And we do. We spend time trying to weave a narrative, right? I mean, some narratives are not hard to weave. I mean, Terrence Coleman was shot. He's dead. His mother is there. Right? I mean, this isn't a hard story to weave. I mean, I think people get it quickly. But there are other things that are more complicated. And for example, the work that we did on behalf of sanctuary cities, right? Sanctuary cities are maligned in a lot of the press. And so we had to spend a lot of time trying to explain, not just in the complaint we filed in federal court, but in our press release and in other things, in community meetings like this, spending a lot of time about the role of sanctuary cities, demystifying, right, like myth bunking, because there are these stereotypes that apply often to either the people we represent, right? The kid is dangerous, right? There are these stereotypes that we have to really work against. And so we do spend a lot of time not just trying to educate the judge or the adjudicator, right? If it's an elected official, or the police commissioner, right? Or the superintendent of schools. And so we spend a lot of time trying to educate the other side, I'll put it that way. And we also try to spend a lot of time educating the public, because like I said, changing hearts and minds. So a lot of it is not just figuring out, the nuances of, what the claim is going to be on behalf of Hope Coleman. It's also, how are we going to frame this? How are we going to do this in a way that is uplifting and that holds our clients' dignity intact? Because this process can be very taxing, and our clients come to us because they are hurt, they're harmed, damaged, legally speaking, right? They have damages that we need to seek. And I feel it's really important for us not just to assert their legal rights, but to assert their dignity. And that's an important component of the work that we do. Yeah.
I was just looking over the website that you were talking about, your website, and I was looking at the Know Your Rights part. So I'm really curious. I know you guys have so many people in your staff, but I'm talking about, cultural competency tests for like firefighters and police officers. Have you ever, or has your organization ever thought about changing the mindset of young teens, like black kids and brown kids? Because I live in public housing, and there's this one kid, he just turned 18. He was shot right outside, I live in public housing too. He was shot right outside my son's window a few years back. He's now in a wheelchair, he's wheelchair bound, and he has no services, so I always try to talk to him and his friends. They're teenagers. He's probably the oldest one, so like 16, 17. I always see them, the ones riding bikes, smoking weed, just hanging out, just wasting their time away. So I always try to engage in a conversation with them. And they don't see past Friday. And I was trying to organize something for them so they can come down to City Hall so they can get a little bit of history. And I organized that with one of the people who work in central staff in the Boston Council. And they all flaked on me. And what they were saying is that, well, we don't want to go down to City Hall. There's a bunch of white people, white men. They don't know what we go through. They don't know this. I don't feel comfortable around white people. So have you ever thought about if your organization has tried to change the mindsets, or have you guys ever aligned with communities to work on that mindset as well?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, the social distance is great. You can stand in Roxbury and look downtown at all of those shiny buildings, but none of that boom that we have experienced in Boston has touched the lives or sidewalks of Roxbury, right? There is so much distance. Many times, because we actually have a small staff of 8, but many times we partner with private attorneys to do the cases. And they provide us with a lot more, resources to be able to do the work. So in the case for Hope Coleman, for example, it's 2 lawyers from my team and 2 lawyers from a small law firm, a boutique law firm that is also supporting us, so we divide the work. And oftentimes, when we have these co-counsel partnerships, which are important when an organization is as small as ours, oftentimes we have meetings in their spaces and bring clients into their spaces. We've had clients who've never used an elevator, who've never been in a skyscraper, who show up at the fancy law firm we're partnering with that is at the top of the Prudential Tower, and they've never been in a building like that. They've never been, I don't know if you guys have been at these really fancy law firms, but those are some like really fancy spaces. I could definitely see people being extremely uncomfortable coming into those spaces, and so we take that into account. We try to do as many meetings as we can, either in safe spaces, right, like literally in our client's home, in their living room, or in our office, which is much less ostentatious. Not like that at all. And sometimes we do it at the firm, right? If you're taking a deposition, the firms have the resources and the setup for that. You go to the law firms for that. So you can't always avoid it. But we do try to be conscious of these issues of social distance and culture. We've also tried to do a lot of work with youth in particular. My whole staff, we all speak very regularly at schools. Many of my staff members are involved in mentorship and other types of programs. We work actively with youth organizations, Boys and Girls Clubs, and the like, and even smaller and more grassroots places that provide after-school programs and things like that. So we interface with youth a lot, and a lot of what people would call at-risk youth. There's more work to be done in those spaces. If people have ideas about, and not just with youth, but just in general, if people have ideas about where we should be going, I would love to hear them. So, you could reach us at office@lawyersforcivilrights.org. That's our email address. And if you have ideas about, hey, we need a lawyers committee person to take a look at this housing issue, or we need a lawyers committee person to take a look at what's happening in this particular neighborhood or community, or there's a community engagement or event that you would like to bring to our attention, or a legal problem. If you go back on the website and something bad happens, Professor Lansmark, you contact us. So we were definitely happy to continue to deepen and expand our visibility and our opportunity to interface with folks. That's important.
I'll just add, I'll take responsibility for this. We didn't program a lot of the kinds of groups that would address the kind of issue that you're talking about into this semester. We've had a couple of speakers in the past, particularly about a year ago, where folks are on the street dealing with raising the aspiration levels and addressing the socialization questions about kids on the street, to better equip them to deal with getting on an elevator or picking something up at the airport, or whatever, just going to downtown and knowing when you go downtown where to go if you need a bathroom, right? Stuff that a lot of us take for granted. We didn't program that into this session. You raise it's a really big issue. I grew up in the projects, but I had a mom who took me to a bunch of places where I got used to like getting on a bus, getting on the subway. And I remember when we were dealing with some youth stuff and I was working in the mayor's office, we did a big event out on Thompson's Island, where we took a couple of thousand kids out to Thompson's Island for a gathering, you know, like a socialization thing before summer jobs. It had never occurred to us that most of those kids had never been on a boat. We just took it for granted.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember girls standing on the dock looking at the boat and literally throwing up at the thought that they had to get on a boat. They were terrified, right? And there's a lot of stuff like that we take for granted, where in fact we know we need to do more to work with young kids who, as you say, don't see beyond Friday.
Yeah.
But that's a whole other set of presentations, I think, and you know, we'll look into doing more of that.
Because you are completely right. Everyone should be able to go into City Hall or the State House. Those are our homes. Those are our spaces, and they should not be intimidating.
Right. There was a hand there, and then I think there's a hand up back there.
So you talked about the increase of hate crimes over the past 3 years. Can you just speak about, like, is it difficult prosecuting hate crimes? Does it have to be under assault if it's not acknowledged as a hate crime, and what that looks like for when children are involved?
Yeah, the hate crime situation is unfortunately something that's been really flaring up. You know, oftentimes police departments are reluctant to call something a hate crime. Oftentimes you're dealing with an assault, right? Somebody got beat up. While he was getting beat up, he was called the N-word or, you know, whatever else. And then police write all of that down, but then they don't classify it as a hate crime. They don't investigate it as a hate crime. They don't prosecute it as a hate crime. They just prosecute the assault. That happens all the time. And often it is until we get involved that the police actually start saying, okay, this has that bias, racial component. We need to look into investigating that as well. So there's a lot of reluctance into investigating it, a lot of reluctance into documenting it. So the fact that we even have the incredible hate crime statistics that we have right now is insane to me, because that is just the tip of the iceberg. Because most of the jurisdictions don't report. Even jurisdictions where we've had people who call us, so we know that there are hate crimes victims in those jurisdictions, and then we look at the hate crime statistics and those jurisdictions don't report it. So this is a widely underreported problem, an underinvestigated problem. We've been doing a significant amount of education. We do workshops and trainings so that people who could be at risk of being hate crimed can know what their rights are, the process to follow. And we've also done a lot of work with law enforcement agencies to make sure that they're not shying away from those difficult questions. And so that work continues. We just did, if you look up my name, Yvonne Espinosa Madrigal, on WBUR, you'll see the op-ed I just did with one of my colleagues talking about hate crimes. And we just released a updated Know Your Rights palm card that we've been sending out. The previous edition of it was sent out to, I think we printed and disseminated over 10,000 printed copies, not to mention digital. So we just did a new batch of printing for that and have been sending it out to places of worship, mosques, churches, synagogues. We've been sending it out to community-based groups, to anybody who would have them. If you guys want them to distribute for yourselves, for your family, just shoot us an email. We'll mail them out, as many as you need. So we've been doing a lot of work to make sure that that's happening because it's underreported. I mean, down the horizon, what I could see is potentially even suing a police department for failing to report and failing to investigate. That is, I think that might be an important thing to do in order to create a ripple effect for other police departments to see that they can incur liability for failing to do that. So that's certainly on our radar. Over there, and then over here. Oh, actually, you had a question, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So 1, 2, 3. Okay.
I just had a question about, like, how do you prosecute, like, or, like, do you touch crimes that are, like, perhaps a little bit harder, like, are harder to pinpoint? So, for example, Airbnb, you mentioned, like, the idea, you mentioned how homeowners were sending, like, blatantly racist messages to clients. However, what about the other types of racism that are going on in Airbnb? So, for example, like, the homeowners who are, like, leasing their properties are, like, if they're African American, they tend to be, like, given a lower rate for their properties because they're African American. However, like, racist messages may not be sent to them, like, explicitly saying, I'm not paying as much because of your, like, race. It's like, what about things that are, like, more, like, there's a lot of racism that goes on in our society, or, like, things that are perhaps culturally insensitive that goes on, but that it's harder to exactly pinpoint and say, this is, like, blatantly discriminatory. Like, how can or should these things be addressed?
That is harder.
Yeah.
You know, blatant and overt discrimination is very easy to see. You know, you smell it, you see it, you know what it is, and you can tackle it. Much easier than something that is covert. That actually brings back to one of the earlier questions where I was talking about disparities in outcomes, and especially data-driven or data-confirmed disparities. That is what we've been using to tease out some of these harder things, right? Like, you might not realize, hypothetically, right? Because well, maybe you're not speaking in hypotheticals, but just hypothetically speaking, if black homeowners are being, you know, are charging less for their homes or encouraged to be charging less for their homes, right? We would have to run a statistical analysis comparing what white homeowners versus black, right? So there are ways to be able to tease that out. It is much more resource intensive. Oftentimes we have to hire experts to help us crunch data. And so we are also in the business of requesting a lot of information and public records so that we can run these type of analysis. But it is harder because it's not as overt or blatant, like you're saying, but it's not impossible to tackle. You know, once we have the statistically valid analysis, it actually becomes quite easy to go into court and to say that there is discrimination happening. And to show, you know, you don't need to show Exhibit A could be like Professor Landsmark, who is personally discriminated, but if he's not available, you know, Exhibit A could be the statistical analysis. And so you don't necessarily need the affected person, you need the data. So we work in both universes. Is this easier to handle? Of course, because he had the discrimination happen to him. He has the email, the exchange. But could we still tackle it without him? Yes. But it just means it's a lot more time and resource intensive.
And I would just add, in part because the matriculating group was talking about this a bit earlier, Northeastern's faculty and students are actually quite proficient at digging into developing and analyzing data from both traditional and non-traditional sources. So I have colleagues who've been looking at Craigslist for data on employment patterns, and looking at Zillow for information on gentrification, and looking at a number of sources we wouldn't have originally thought to have looked at, but we now have the ability to scrape all kinds of interesting stuff, or to set up accounts that enable us to take a look at things like the deployment of ride-hailing vehicles to see whether they really are serving all neighborhoods equally. And there's going to be a conference, actually it'll take place at the State House on April 26th that's being put together by the Boston area research initiative, which brings together a number of the universities and private sector sources of this kind of research that are now in a position to work with nonprofits who need the data but who don't have the time or the staff resource or the access to the algorithms to be able to dig this stuff up. And that's part of the bridge that we find ourselves working on at this point. Northeastern has become increasingly tech-oriented. And the question that we're raising is, once we have this skill, how do we apply it to the social sciences and human services and human sciences in a way wherein that kind of expertise does not just go to Amazon to help them improve their delivery service, but also goes to community groups to help you do the kind of work that you're doing. So you're going to see more of that kind of work being done, but you've got to have the technical resource and the algorithms to be able to dig into that stuff.
That's fabulous. I love that. And I think when you said traditional, non-traditional sources, it reminded me, in housing in particular, you could test for discrimination, and that is admissible in court as evidence. So if somebody says to me, I went to this address to try to get that one-bedroom apartment, and I didn't get it, and I have a feeling that the person was racist, we could send a tester or multiple testers to see what reactions they get, right? Send a white person and they might be told, apartment's available immediately, $500. Send a black person, apartment was just taken, or apartment is available, $800, right? And you could test for that, and all of that is admissible. And so the testing, particularly in the housing space, is really, really beneficial and can shore up in the way Professor Landsberg was just talking about. It could make the difference between he said, she said, versus we have this data or we have the testing information. So that does happen. That's huge. Yeah.
Just one, I have a number of questions, but I'm going to try to limit it to one. I will limit it to one. And that is regarding it seems lately, and I think it's the cupcake case, I think, where religious beliefs are now being used as a means of discrimination. And
that's right.
It reminds me of back in the 1960s when, people were discriminated against and not allowed to, come into theaters and shops and things. Have you had any cases like that? And if not, are you prepared for cases like that?
I think that's an excellent point. The Masterpiece Cake Shop case that you're talking about, it was the Supreme Court case coming from Colorado where the gay couple was not allowed to get their cake for their wedding because the owners of the shop said that it would violate their deep-seated religious beliefs to be forced to create a cake for the wedding of a same-sex couple. And the Supreme Court skirted the issue a bit, and it did find in favor of the shop on some narrow, basically administrative grounds, but it did leave open the possibility that we will see more of these cases because it didn't just slam the door and say, no, this is not a viable claim, and it didn't even give guidance on if you have a situation like that, what trumps, right? Religion or sexual orientation, right? Because they're saying, I can't get a cake, you're discriminating me because I'm gay, which is a covered class of people under Colorado and many states, not all, but many states, including ours. You cannot discriminate against people based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Colorado is one of those states. So then they're protected. The people who are buying the cake was protected under Colorado anti-discrimination law. And then the shop owners are saying, we have a religious right, a religious liberty, a religious interest in not serving this particular subset of the population. So they're also asserting their rights. So it's this conflict, the way the question is being posed, about whether, you know, religious liberty trumps other categories, because I think it might, and the way you posed the question certainly does implicate it, other categories, right? What about if I said, in my religious views, I can't serve unmarried women, right? Or women who've had an abortion, or women on birth control, or people with HIV, right? There are so many permutations of this that you could really go down a slippery slope of using essentially any identity factor to exclude people from the stream of commerce and from those financial and business transactions, from accessing those services and opportunities. At least the Supreme Court didn't do too much damage, I would say, and the issue remains essentially open. I think the court wanted a better fact pattern, a better case to be able to tease out these different conflicting issues. So it didn't speak extensively on this, but it certainly left the door open. And I think that's a big, you're right, that is a big issue. We have not litigated this at all. We have not had any cases in this arena. But I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of these emerging areas that we have to be in the lookout for. Because it is, I believe, deeply problematic when you start pitting identity and religion in that way. At the same time, I also think in terms of businesses, it is critical that we maintain access to all business services for everyone. And even when you think about the civil rights movement, right? Like, you couldn't sit in a lunch counter. You couldn't access other services. You were being excluded from the stream of commerce, right? You could only sit in the back of the bus. You couldn't sit in the front of the bus. All of these things were so pivotal in launching the civil rights movement to begin with. And the set of laws that we have in almost virtually every state about public accommodations. You know, you cannot just say, my business is going to be closed to black people. That's illegal. And so this is, I would say, a interesting challenge in the 21st century to what have been long-standing public accommodation laws. And we really will have to, I think, defend the full integrity of our public accommodations laws to make sure that they don't get diluted. Because I feel so many people were thinking about this as a cupcake case, right? And that's the way it was being discussed. That's not the way I see it. I see this as really creating a fracture at the heart of anti-discrimination and public accommodations laws that have been long-standing in our country, going back to the height of the civil rights movement. And so when you talk about it as a cupcake, it kind of like sounds silly. All they want is a cake, right? They just want a cake. Go get your cake somewhere else. Well, it's a lot more nuanced than that. And this is going to be one of the new battlegrounds moving forward.
Yeah, we'll take one more. I did mention in our earlier session, my first trip to Washington, D.C. as a kid. My mother and I drove down were driven down to Washington, and after a 6-hour drive, we hit the outskirts of Washington, and we needed to stop to use a bathroom. And we drove into a gas station, and we're told at midnight, give or take, that that gas station's bathroom was not available to us because we were black, and unfortunately, any of the gas stations that might have taken us in were closed. So after a 6 or 7 hour drive, there was no bathroom that we could use on the outskirts of Washington. It was deeply humiliating. Obviously, decades later, I still remember it. But any time I think about the cupcake case, for example, I realize that it's exactly the same.
It's the same.
And when it's justified on what purport to be religious grounds, then I wonder whatever happened to, you know, around church and state relationships, and what does trump what? And clearly that is an area of growing concern. Anyway, last question. Oh, sorry, there were two. Quickly.
All right, so going off of the cupcake case, would be, you had mentioned we're seeing a new generation of like racist or bigoted people like feeling comfortable expressing their ignorance. And we're seeing the slow progress of like the laws updating around like microaggressions or things that maybe aren't overtly racist. So we're also seeing like social media and like Twitter, like identifying individuals who show up to these rallies and like kind of the court of like social opinion, holding people accountable or businesses accountable for acts that went viral. Is there like, as we think about the law going forward, like a way to legally hold people accountable using like either technology like facial ID or stuff, like you were at this rally that caused, you know, this impact, or this one's a little out there, but holding individuals. So I was thinking of the case with the boys at in DC with the Native American man who they were like intimidated, right? Like holding them accountable for like the viral like physiological impact that they have of like people who are scared. Like I just started seeing groups of young boys. I was like, whoa, like, especially young white boys. I was like implicitly afraid of them because of what I've seen in the narrative. Not necessarily them, but like, well, they could do whatever they want, and they're gonna get all of these people to give them a platform. Like legally holding people accountable for like digital terror, I guess.
Let me collect both questions and then I'll.
So half of my life I started off as a tenant, and the other half of my life I've been a landlord. So I've been a good landlord because I remember being a tenant. The point is that I ran into some tenants that were really a problem, where a tenant wouldn't pay their rent, and when I wanted to evict them, they called in the housing authority to tell me the windows don't work. So I went to replace the window, they wouldn't let the people in to replace the window. I got tired of it, didn't fight it at all. They eventually moved out. My point is that the end result is that I'm interested in selling my places and not being a landlord. I was providing a service that's very necessary like other services, but I'm not going to be in the business for that long. And eventually, a bigger company is going to take it over, and they're going to be able to fight the battle. And I think we're going to lose a lot of housing if you go back to a rent control situation. So I don't think there are any other, landlord rights people here. Most people have tenants' rights. Remember, I was a tenant, so I was also interested in that. But I do think that we have to be aware of what happens if we don't give some credence to the rights of the landlords. Otherwise, you may have no housing at all.
That's a good point about the market. The market is what the market is, right? I think the important part is to make sure that we can make sure that people are not being evicted improperly. Of course, some people take advantage, and that scenario you're describing, it sounds like somebody was taking advantage. But I think it is important to.
He was a lawyer.
Oh,
Oh, wow.
yeah, well. Not all lawyers are nice like me. But I agree with you. I think that there is there's a balance to be struck. And I'm not saying I have the right balance in mind. I definitely feel that, and I deeply believe in this. I think that a rising tide does lift all boats, and we have to make sure that our economic system, and whether that's in terms of wages, work opportunities, housing opportunities, that does happen, that we actually can spread the wealth and be able to lift all boats. So I think market-driven solutions are good, but I think we need to also make sure that we're not leaving anybody behind, and that we, I don't know, for lack of a better term, that we're doing it in a way that is equitable, that is incorporating protections for people, you know. And unfortunately, the bottom line is that not everything that is bad is legally actionable. You know, your boss might treat you like crap, but that doesn't mean that that you might have a claim against your boss, or you might actually be a really bad landlord and mistreat your tenants. That doesn't necessarily mean that your tenants have a claim, right? So the bottom line, and I think you summarized it well in the beginning, the law does not recognize every form of harm or injury. And this is something that's very difficult to explain to most people, particularly when they have suffered, when they feel like my landlord shouldn't have done that, or even my tenant shouldn't have done that, right? Like, the things that are actionable and not actionable are actually quite limited. The court recognizes only certain injuries. And even when they recognize the injury, they might not even rule in your favor. And if they rule in your favor, the remedies that are available are limited. So it is it's not a silver bullet by any means, which again goes to why we need to have multiple complementing methodologies to advance the work that we want to do. Because the courts don't speak in terms of microaggressions. That is not actionable. That is not cognizable. And trust me, we're in the business of getting creative and finding ways to have standing, to have an opportunity to get our clients in court so that they can have their day in court. But it's not, you know, many of the things that happen at work, many of the indignities that happen to us either at home or at work, those things are not actionable. It has to rise through a certain threshold. And so as strong as we believe that we have been victims of discrimination or that we've been wronged in a way, I'm not saying you haven't been. I'm just saying that maybe legally, it's going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to make a case. There are limitations with what we can do with the law. And that's why it's really important for us to continue to be in communication and collaboration. Because there are things for my shop to do, and there are things for other groups, whether it's pushing policy, you know, harassing the superintendent when they come next week. Not that I'm saying you should do that, not at all. Hypothetically. Hypothetically. Or harassing the police commissioner, hypothetically. Those are all things that I feel, let me correct myself, not harassing, but I think it is important to advocate. Yeah, it's important to interrogate and to contest and to hold, yes, to hold people to account and to ask questions. That is your right, you know, and to apply political pressure, to apply social pressure. And sometimes those things can be just as effective as coming to my shop to try to file a lawsuit, right? And so we have to know what are the tools that are available for us. What is the best tool to use for those particular problems and challenges that we're trying to use, and then try to move that forward in that way, you know? But I think it is important for us not to lose hope, and for us to be very optimistic. There were things that we have accomplished that people at that time never thought possible. Kids who went into integrated classrooms based on a dream that this could happen. That this could happen and that this could be good for us as a society, for all of us to live, learn, and grow together and from each other. And those successes are the things that we've inherited and that we're building on. So I want to challenge you to go out there and to be creative and to be courageous and bold in helping to create the society you want to see. You don't have to be excited about the stuff I was talking about. Find what excites you and move that forward. Be an advocate for yourself, for your family, and for your community on the issues that you care about. And then I think we can all start contributing one step at a time from our corners to building the world we want to live in and that we want to raise our kids in. So thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Ivan.